Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president. Welcome back, Father.
Well, Colleen, as always, a great blessing to be with you again.
It's great to have you here in the studio, Father. And we're going to be having a really exciting conversation today talking about Humanae Vitae, because obviously contraception totally ties into our mission, and that's mostly what this document was dealing with. So we're going to talk about that and, just unpack it. So I think starting off with a little historical context would be good. What was going on in the world when Humanae Vitae was released?
So that's a loaded question.
Exactly.
because you really have to step back into a time when there was just great flux, great change, great expectations occurring in the 1960s, leading into when we see Humanae Vitae promulgated in the latter part of the 60s, and so you're looking at sociological, demographic issues. People were concerned about overpopulation. It had a changing world. And also saw the change in how women, were functioning in society, acting in society, working in society. This was also affecting conversation and the way of people's approach. So there were many factors that were bringing this conversation to bear. And we also know that within the society itself, there was, moral issues that were becoming more readily accepted, and as a consequence, we saw even legally where contraception that was once considered illegal began to be accepted as something legalized.
Immoral things that were being accepted, right?
Right.
Okay,
right.
I think you said moral, so I wanted to clarify that.
Sorry. And so when you think about how those were affecting this conversation, and so, remember, as you know, from a legal point, at moment something becomes decriminalized, it, in a sense, it gives it moral credibility in people's mind. So, as we would see today with so much about abortion and euthanasia and other moral issues that we see today, the moment, well, it's legal. Okay, we just have to accept it. So in many ways, people were just kind of normalizing a behavior. So all that affected.
Well, and also it was 1930 when the Anglicans said that couples could use birth control in certain situations for quote unquote the hard cases, which, as we all know, is always a slippery slope.
Right. And
so you also had a changing within the Protestant mindset. And so I think people were wondering if the Catholic Church was going to change their position, which obviously the Catholic Church
And I think
can't.
it's important, as you just pointed, is that prior to the Lambeth Council, you realize that the Christian Church, accepted the fact that contraception was opposed to the good of marriage, and obviously was not good for society. Because why? It assaulted a good marriage and the ends of marriage. And so what you saw was this breaking down. And really, it's only the Catholic Church today still that it adheres and upholds this great teaching on the dignity of marriage and the beauty of the ends of marriage and the wonder of conjugal love. And so that's why today she's so, in a way, the last bastion against this tide. And that's what also brings her into so many conversations and attack and misrepresentation, misinterpretation, you name it, on this single issue. I say this globally, out of all of the issues the church deals with, this is still a fundamental issue that often brings the ire of so many people, including, sadly, Colleen, even our own Catholic family.
Was there confusion about the church's teaching on contraception before Humanae Vitae, or was it pretty well established and people just expected it to change?
I mean, I go back to my own grandparents, and when not that this subject was table talk. It was never table talk, but when it did happen, and as I aged, you would hear different conversations, and I think that people were looking at larger families, and they were looking at how to care for their children, how to support their children in this changing world, and of course, here in the narrative, this overpopulation, it really did affect how people thought. I have some very, very dear friends who are now in their late 80s who often bring this up, and still repeat the narrative. So obviously it was impacting people, at least in mindset, at least in the way they talked about it. And of course, like I said, like so many things, the morality of or the immorality of this particular approach was a question that people were asking. I mean, I remember priests who were in their now would be in their 80s and 90s. I remember as a seminarian, as a young priest, this would come up in our conversations because they were taught, and in their days of formation, that this was something the church was going to change, or they thought it was going to change, or maybe there was an impression it was going to change, and so some of them actually never addressed it, in their teaching in parishes, and matter of fact, some of them I know who have passed from this world said that at one time they just, didn't come out and endorse it, but they never confronted it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Humanae Vitae came forward, they had to reevaluate, their approach to this, and because they were given the impression, that this was a changing, evolving teaching, which, as Paul VI points out, is not.
No.
And so it was a kind of a difficult time, for people, and especially as the secular language becomes more prominent. Television, programming, all that affects how people approach and how they, in a sense, how they get their information.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no doubt, and we know that it was obviously part of the conversation of private. This is between a husband and wife. Should we enter into that conversation? We heard the use of privacy become an argument even within the legalization of abortion.
Yeah.
So all that was playing into this.
Okay. And obviously we were also talking, when we were talking about this beforehand, is that you had Costi Connubii that came out in, I think it was 1930, that also condemned birth control. So I guess in that 30-year period was when a lot of change was going on. So people expected that a revisiting of the subject might lead to change, when obviously something that's been taught by the church from the beginning isn't going to be changed.
And here, I guess what we mean by change is not necessarily change in the church as much as the society, the situations in the world we're changing very quickly. Obviously, going into a world war, coming out of a second world war,
sexual revolution,
right? All this, and as we know, the philosophies and ideologies that would emerge in the 19th century and the 20th century, all these things are there. And that's why when we're talking about this, is kind of, you got to sit down with a number of textbooks and history books and really bringing all that into the conversation, which we can't do
all of it right now.
But it's important to really, for people who want to understand, who have never read Costi Connubii, to read it. It's a response, to the Lamb of the Council, or to the results of that reality, and the church responded. And so it's the same thing here with Paul VI. He's responding. And, and if we step back and even think about what John the 23rd, I know we're going to talk a little bit about, what made this papal commission occur. And I would say that we can look at the negative in the sense that we can see that there are people who may have had a very ill intent about what they were trying to drive and trying to get the church to accept and to endorse. But at the same time, I often think that the church has always done is it looks at what's happening and it responds. It's presented a moral dilemma, it's presented situations, and we still do this today. When you think about how the church is responding to issues of current issue, like gender identity confusion. So this is what's going on in the culture, and the church responds. And just like with Humanae Vitae, they don't like what they hear from the church because the perennial teaching remains. So, but I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think we should go into a little bit of, you just mentioned John the 23rd founded the Pontifical Commission on Birth Control in 1963. And I think it was 5 years later was when they issued, 1966 was when they issued a report on their decisions about birth control. And they basically said, this group said in their report that it was permissible in certain circumstances. And the two key ones were basically that they argued that openness to marriage is spread throughout the entire marriage, not in each individual act. So as long as the couple intends to welcome children, they can use contraception at different points as long as their general intention for their entire marriage, the sum of it comes out higher on the side of openness to life. And then the other argument was basically that using contraception was no different than like having sex in accord with the fertile and infertile periods of the woman's cycle. So yeah, and then Pope Paul VI obviously addresses both of those in Humanae Vitae. So can you just talk a little bit about what his responses to that were and go into that conversation? And
what would be good for our audience, and I know you're going to put this in the notes and so forth, is really to come back, to the document itself. It's a very short document. One can sit down within drinking a cup of coffee or a hot tea and actually read through the whole document. And so, he addresses this and really by raising the questions first. What are the questions? What are the situations people are talking about? And then he goes right into the heart of it when he talks about in paragraph 12, and this inseparability of the ends, this unitive and procreative. And here he just unravels the recommendations. He unravels, and exposes the error in the mindset that you just articulated from the Commission, and saying that these two ends are inseparable. And by showing that and teaching that, and so what I'll say here is, so he talks about this teaching often set forth by the magisterium is founded upon this inseparable connection, willed by God and unable to be broken by man or his own initiative. So he just clearly, defines, this is something that is unchangeable, and that as we approach this, is to recognize that this inseparability is a core in understanding marriage, understanding conjugal love, and how in every moment of a conjugal act, one must always be open to life.
Yeah.
And this is, this kind of, obviously, people, don't fully always understand this language. But that's what he's trying to, again, return people to anchor them in this. So I would say to our audience, it's important to go back and read paragraph 12. Well, read the whole document. But there, if you go to paragraph 12, he really just broadens this conversation and doesn't focus in on, he focuses in on intention, he focuses in on the act, and shows how both intention and act must be inseparable.
Well, and he also says that man on his own initiative may not break between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. And I was saying before this, we know that because if you had a husband and wife who for most of their marriage were in love and most of their acts were unitive and procreative, but at one point, one of the spouses rapes the other one because they want a child, and they remove that unitive part, and it's just using the other person for the sake of getting a child.
Right.
We know that's wrong. Like you have this gut instinct to say like, no, that's terrible. And you can't say that the sum of all the other good acts is going to be okay with the using of the other person in an abusive way. But yet when you're arguing that you can use contraception in marriage occasionally, as long as most of the marriage is open to life, it's the same thing. If the two ends are unitive and procreative, and we have a problem with taking away the unitive just to get the procreative, you also have to have a problem with taking away the procreative just to get the unitive.
Well, he talks about, and that's a good way of looking at this, and help put it into kind of look at this. What do you think about this?
What's the emotional response to this, the inverse of it?
But by looking at the totality of the person, and that's what he begins with as well in paragraph 11. When he talks about the total person, you got to look at that. So it's not like I can separate myself and act this way and over here intend something. So it's the idea that there's a total response. There is a total self-giving. There is not a usury at all. It is really an giving of oneself and receiving from the other, and not taking. And this is something that's so important as we look both at the act, the intention of conjugal love, this wonderful unitive, as well as the inseparability of the procreative, that is a single act, and responding, to this opportunity that God has given within conjugal love. And that gets lost, and so it's today, especially today. But let's be honest, human nature, in its weakness, in its woundedness, sometimes intellectually and doesn't understand, and so obviously there's this tension between the will and the intellect, and so it's what seems to be a good, and people can rationalize themselves into creating this in mindset that this is a good, as you just kind of said, that the end justifies the means here, but that's not the case. And so what Paul VI does is just re-anchors. He plants the feet once again in response to the demographic questions, to the sociological questions, to the evolving culture around that is becoming very permissive and very acceptant of certain behaviors, and saying that, no, this is not the response. The response is to return to a perennial truth, to go back to what was said in Costa Connubii, what has been said throughout the church's teaching over the centuries, is that this inseparability. And that is the real challenge. Now, we can spend, and probably ought to spend, an entire episode just talking about inseparability. And there are many wonderful books out there that speak about this. But this is what he's driving. And he also says, by safeguarding both of these essential aspects, the unitive and procreative, the conjugal act preserves in its fullness the sense of true marital love and its ordination toward man's most highest calling, to parenthood. But what happens is we're trying to separate, pull apart what cannot be pulled apart. And to do so changes the act, changes even the intention, And so as we'll see in some of the prophecies that Paul VI would offer, that if this mindset were to take root, what would happen? Today are no longer prophecies; they are realities.
They are, that's part of.
And we can see what happens when we do pull them apart. And as a priest, of 30 plus years, and having sat with couples who have struggled, with the issue of contraception, and themselves embracing contraception and the mindset, only to realize the harm and the danger and what it's caused within their marriage, and what it's led to in their marriage, the harm that it caused between their love for each other, and though they were well intended, it resulted in something very harmful, and they said, and to come out of it, brought their marriage to a richness and to a fullness and to an acceptance of limitation too, and also of cooperation with God, and to be a co-creator, not one who takes their own initiative, goes by their own power, but one who is participating, cooperating, and to see that how each one brings to that relationship, husband and wife, this, what John Paul would talk about, this complementarity and this complementary relationship that is there. So that's all mixed in here. So
how does Pope St. Paul VI respond to the idea that artificial birth control is no different than having sex within a woman's fertile and infertile cycles?
Obviously, you just, because again, we've introduced something that is outside of the act. That's something that is, in a sense, that when you cooperating with. So in natural family planning, we can again spend an entire episode on this, which again is always good to talk about. It's cooperating. It's cooperating with God's design, and you're not introducing anything outside of that design. You're not. Intention is not to prevent, in the sense of to stifle God's design, but to always remain open, acceptant, and so that even if there is a legitimate moment of postponement that one is desiring, and so incorporates with the natural biological cycle, its intent is not to stifle, to prevent, and to permanently harm, but to cooperate, and also accept the fact that if a child is conceived in this beautiful moment of time, we receive that child as a fruit of our love, and we accept. So versus in artificial introduction, in the sense whether that be by some type of prophylactic or some type of chemical, or we're literally introducing a different intent. We are purposely stifling the natural biological functionality. We are our contraceptive mentality is contra. We're not for life. We're saying no to life. And as a result, when contraception fails, what do we know today as a result? Leads to a person to abortion mindset. Yeah. So you can see the two very differently, and that's just kind of a little nutshell look at. We can obviously get much deeper into the richness. I didn't do justice, to the beauty and wonder of natural family planning, and it's how it is really participatory, and the two are still contributing with each other and to each other and receiving from each other. Nothing's been introduced. There is no interruptus. There is no direct intent of prevention. It's cooperation.
It's just saying that God has given us these different cycles, so we're going to use those as he's given to us, but not do anything to directly go against his plan of fertility.
Exactly. And it's such a beautiful way of knowing one's own limitedness, and that I'm not the creator, and I'm not the arbiter, I'm using for reason and understanding, and also, as we know, in the grave situation that we may have to, result in a postponement of a conception. But if a conception occurs, we praise God and we thank God for the beauty of this life. And very different than the mindset that's created, when one becomes the arbiter, the decision maker, the one who's intervening, and the one who is determining, I will create, I will not create. It's a very different mindset.
Trying to get in the way and play God. Yeah. What are the predictions that Pope St. Paul VI made in Humanae Vitae? I think he made 4 of them, of what would happen in the future if people embrace this mindset.
Back to the wonderful encyclical paragraph 17 is where we want to lead. And here it's important to look at, so one, you've really already brought up by using the example you did, usury. Looking at another person, in this case, what Paul VI points out is how man will look at woman. So within marriage. So he's looking at how does man look at his wife. And if she is a means to an end, if that's all she is, then we are talking about the objectification of woman, and no longer seen as complementarity, no longer seen, as one who is contributing, giving freely, self-donating, all that language that revolves around conjugal love, the conjugal act, marriage itself, the totality of the person, all of it gets pushed aside, because now the person, because they have a need, becomes a means to fulfill that need. And so no longer cooperation with God, and also the limitation that, that learning abstinence, learning that, that maybe there is a legitimate reason for my wife and myself not to have conjugal relations at this time, because, whatever that reason may be, learning the discipline of self-control, self-mastery, learning not to objectify one's wife, to treat her as a thing. So he prophesied that contraception changes the mentality. And we know today, study after study after study has revealed that it does. It changes one's mind. It changes the chemistry. And it changes, the whole way that we look at human sexuality. And as we know, if we return back to paragraph 12 and the inseparability, when you introduce contraception, even in a natural way, we can use the natural method in a contraceptive mentality. So it's very dangerous and would be morally wrong. And so but in this situation, it ruptures the two ends. It separates, it divorces, this expression of conjugal love. So no longer is it conjugal love. We've actually changed the act. It's become a biological act. It's become something different than what it is meant to be, and no longer seen as giftedness, but purely as I have a need. That has to be fulfilled. You can see how the danger this would be. And today, again, sitting inside the confessional, working with couples, in marital counseling and spiritual direction. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about that on here, but I can tell you story after story of the danger. And then, of course, the second one now is where he's now going to move this further in, but it kind of moves a little deeper into that objectification. We can see how an industry itself can begin to evolve. So here today, we can look at the pornography industry. We can look at, the whole sexual revolution and the consequences of that, and this promiscuity and that we see in the culture today. So he says this mindset leads to that because, again, we've objectified the human person, whether male or female. All right. So we can see how this leads no longer to what marriage itself expresses. Inseparability also means exclusivity, also means an indissolubleness, that this is an indissoluble relationship until death do us part. There's this commitment that she and he make to each other in every moment, that they promise to each other. And children, again, which have a right, to be welcomed into this environment where they are welcomed. And they are the fruit of their love, not a kind of a determined fruit or an undetermined fruit or just an accepted fruit, but to see that this is the longing of their love, that the fruit of their love is the possibility and always is the possibility of a third person. That's a very different mindset than what we see when we introduce a contraceptive mindset. And so that promiscuity, that kind of that permissiveness begins to flourish. And again, we can look now many decades later, before decades later, and see, oh, here we are.
Yeah.
All right.
Definitely.
And then another aspect is when he talks about, I'm going to go to the fourth one, and that is the government side of it. So, which is kind of this industry. And so where government then can use this. Now, got to kind of get back, Colleen, in the mindset here. So if you have people that are worried about an overpopulation, they're worried about this population boom. We're never going to be able to sustain the planet, which is still here today. All right.
Despite the fact that we're going into a demographic winter.
And for you and for me and for our audience that are familiar with Human Life International, that we know are familiar with the Kissinger report, all right, the National Security Memorandum, that we talk about in NSSM 200. You look at this and say, and if you don't know that, go back and look it up. We can put it in the notes. But you see,
I can link to the episode that we have with it as
how
well.
Government will use this to be able to control for its own benefit. And so obviously this has come to reality.
Well, and we see that even with China's one-child policy. People are usually pretty familiar with that, even if they haven't heard of NSSM 200. But that's another example of this.
Exactly. And today, and we know that the document of the Kissinger report that I'm making reference to is still state policy. It is tentacled in all of our policies.
Promote abortion, sterilization, and contraception.
Reproductive, we call it reproductive rights, and all around the world.
We get their natural resources,
and we keep the population down. And so so you see how these kind of unfold, and so you look at some of these, and then the third one. I'll let you toss that one out.
I think we're on because you went to the fourth one. Right. So we had the husbands and wives objectifying each other.
Right.
We had an increase of promiscuity in society. We had governments using this for their own benefit because he made a really good point in there that if it's legitimate for a couple to use this for some reason, it's going to then be like, why shouldn't it be legitimate for the government to also use it for their own benefit?
That's right.
And then the fourth one is, this is from our resource article, the tendency of man to wrongly think that he should have absolute dominion over his or her own body, including his procreative powers or those of others.
Right. So so all of them,
that's from our resource article. I don't think it's the exact quote from the document.
Yeah. So paragraph 17, and that's kind of why I tossed it to you so you can pull from that resource article. And so because when you look at them, and some people even say there's a fifth one, but it's how you break them apart. And so you look at how we can see divorce today has become normalized in so many cultures. Very few countries. I think Philippines right now might be the only country where divorce is not legalized. And thank goodness. But right now
Vatican City too.
It's being and being pushed. But you look at this and you realize these are the consequences. These are the so we have to, and that's what I like about what Paul VI does. He gets underneath and exposes the error.
Well, and I mean, okay, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but if you're saying the tendency of man to wrongly think that he should have absolute dominion over his or her own body, we see that with the transgender movement. We see that with IVF. We see that with surrogacy. We see that with all sorts of things where people are taking, playing God over their own bodies.
That's right. Euthanasia. So all these types of things fit in. And so that's what I'm saying. When you get underneath, and so even though you might have had a commission and different reasons why the commission was supportive of the mindset or, gave their rationale for in support of, what he does is he exposes the error of that thought. And then very, very much like Costa Canubi did in exposing why the Lambeth decision was such an error and what it will lead to in itself, giving prophetic statements. And if we kind of push forward in time, Colleen, and we look at Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth with John Paul II, now he's looking back over what has been the consequence when we break away from the moral tradition of the church, when we break away from the objective truth about man and woman, and when we break away from an understanding of intention and object and the means by which we obtain the so-called good that we've determined we would like to achieve, and not evaluating it and realizing that the end does not justify the mean. And so and that's just a simplified way of looking at a very important document that I would encourage our audience to also be familiar with. But he's responding to these errors, and he's saying this is why there's an error. And it's no different than what we see in anything today that our Holy Father addresses on these issues as well. So his comments recently on surrogacy, his comments on IVF, in vitro fertilization, his comments about the whole transgender identity confusion movement that's out there. So our Holy Father, like John Paul and like Benedict and, Paul VI, John the 23rd, and going back, just they're addressing those moral dilemmas that we as a society are looking at and sometimes determine that we want to do, and we're called out on it. And Humanae Vitae on the gift of human life is something, it's a document that's most despised, and yet not read. And I often say to people, have you read it? What is it within this that you disagree with? What good are you disagreeing with here? Because what the Holy Father says, that the church cannot change what God has, in sense, has in his will brought into being. We don't have the right to do that. And to do that would be to violate this good that God has given. And so he's raising up the good. Yeah. He's saying, here is the beauty. And so we don't have a right, and a couple doesn't have the right, to violate this good. To do so violates the good in each other, but it violates also the good that God has set into motion and what God desires from both of them in their cooperation through marriage and through conjugal love. And so we can see the consequences today. And for myself, I see it on a global scale. Yeah. When I travel around the world, and and the realization is some of the dilemmas that are being raised are still with us today. There are issues today that are affecting people all over the world. And so what is the remedy? And as we all know today, looking back over time, the loss of the sense of God has so blinded people to the consequences of their choices. And so what do we see today? And even in the United States, divorce rates continue to grow. Even though right now people are choosing not to marry, they cohabitate. We know that permissive behavior in some ways is normative today. We know the pornography industry makes billions, if not trillions of dollars globally. We know the exploitation of people through human trafficking, as an example on the sex side of that equation, but on the labor side of it, they're being trafficked, they're being used. We see this, how it affects, as you already mentioned so beautifully, given examples, surrogacy, using another person, that whether it be by intent or in a sense that, it could be a donor to one's wife and it's the wife bearing the child, but you're still using another person to get to this end. And so we see how that affects in vitro fertilization, all that stuff flows when we rupture, when we breach.
And it creates broken people. I was listening to one podcast recently, which was people that had been deceived. They were donor conceived. So not necessarily IVF, but also it was called insemination. And they were more pro that industry than I was expecting, considering it was people coming out of it. But their stories were so tragic. Right. I was listening to it, just it was like a soap opera, but it was people's real lives, just how messed up relationships were. And I was just sitting there being like, this is the consequences of, not just because of that, the people, there was multiple other problems feeding into it, but I just felt so sad for the people that were on it. And it really was a very clear view of what happens when you break away from natural law and break away from God's plan for marriage and sexuality.
And also the fact that we receive, we are not the one who is the originator. We are recipients, and there is a limitedness to my life, and there are boundaries, and so I think to really look positively, at those limits, but also at those potentialities that are there, and that's giftedness. That's to be gifted. Someone, our Creator, has gifted us, and so beautifully He's made man for woman, and the very physiology is made for each other. It's an undeniable fact. And so that when these two do approach each other in conjugal love, that there is always the possibility that the fruit of this act is another human being. And so to do anything to the contrary changes the very nature and the very purpose and the very wonder and awe and even the limitedness of it, that man cannot conceive on his own.
Yeah.
Woman cannot conceive on her own. They need each other. And so when we bring in artificial means, now here we're talking no longer assisting, that's on reproductive technologies, and there are some moral means to assist, not replace, right?
Yes.
It's in our language. But here by introducing something artificial to marital love, artificial to the very nature of marital love, the very nature of man and woman, we are changing the nature, the purpose.
And we've talked before about how contraception and IVF are two sides of the same coin. One is sex without babies, the other is babies without sex.
Right.
And it's the same thing. When you're dividing that those two go together, you end up in chaos. And then same with contraception, like we were saying.
That's right.
Obviously, dividing the unitive from the procreative is going to cause harm in their relationship and then in society, obviously.
Exactly. And as you said earlier, by using your example, when you also no longer see the good, and that you're contributing to the good, and that you recognize that there is a good that you must also, not violate, and also to respect. So we've lost a sense of the respect that is due to woman and woman owes to man, and how they owe that to each other. And we've also lost a sense of the awe of being in the presence of a person that's made in the image and likeness of God, and that God has given me an intellect and a will to be able to choose the good, to know the good, to see the good, and to work toward that good. And does that mean, that because we're weak and there are moments when we are tempted, but that again is where we come to grace and we approach God and asking for guidance and understanding and to enlighten our hearts and our minds. And Paul VI talks about this, from a rational, from a reason, what we have learned, what we know, what we understand, what's been revealed to us, by God Himself, and so the author of life. And so all this comes into this conversation to me, which is so beautiful that, again, I'm working with couples for marriage. This is what we talk about. And, what is God's plan for you? What is your vocation? Just tell me, how do you know your vocation? Talk about it. And it gets the couple to express, in a way, all that's here, minus paragraph 17, because they don't need to talk about that. But all the rest they do need to talk about. Do they understand? And so it's this generative ability, is a cooperation in God's generative love. I mean, it's just, but this language, which John Paul would pick up, as we know, in the great teaching on the theology of the body, that he would take this to another level and really begin to bring to bear this beauty and make people talk about it in ways that people had not talked about it before or thought about it, and it wasn't some new teaching. He's just raising the teaching of the church, bringing it out there for people to talk about. Even Pope Benedict spoke about this so beautifully. So there's so much of approach. And I would say that the biggest challenge today, I don't think is any different than it was in the 60s when Paul VI promulgated Humanae Vitae. The world was still in chaos. Demographic issues still unfolded. Today, we have a demographic winter. People don't want to accept the fact, but yet it is. And we have a fertility crisis. And all that's been engineered. It's a self-inflicted wound.
And I think it's going to get worse. Well, it's interesting because there's a trend going on like right now, or not a trend, but it's come to light because Bumble just did these ads basically like condemning celibacy. Like, oh, that's not the answer. And then all these women are coming out and being like, no, like, how dare you? But like secular women who are just like, men are so terrible, we're not having sex with them. And obviously you shouldn't if you're not married. But it's just, it'll be interesting to see what happens on the demographic side of things when people start maybe moving away from having like the artificial means, but then just straight up not getting married or having children because the relationships have been so damaged, like in a negative way.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just kind of pulling back to that paragraph 12, that inseparability. I mean, think about, but I love you, honey, but I don't love your fertility.
Yeah.
So we basically, I mean, I've heard that, spoken different ways, but it's kind of what you're just talking about, is that we kind of have placed the gift of man and the gift of woman at odds with each other. And the fact that we today consider in so many ways to be pregnant to be an unwelcome reality. It's a disease in some people's minds, and, it's not good for the planet and all. So all this narrative is still, all that's as a result of a lack of understanding of the beauty of what it means to be husband and wife, and where the sexual act is only to be employed, offered, shared, and what it's and how it is always it's inseparable, both in unitive and in procreation. And to know that it's within that environment where children are to be welcomed and to be raised and to be nurtured. And so all the things that Paul VI warned, which Costa Canubi warned, and many others before warned, when we start breaking away from God's design and God's plan and what we can come to know in the natural order of things, from just a reasonable understanding, and that's why prior to the legalization acceptance of contraception, it was perceived as a moral problem. Pornography was always considered something immoral, not good for society. So to see society move and begin to call what is good bad and what is bad good changes how people approach, and the consequences are here before us.
Well, and going back to what I was saying too, when you start using the other person, it creates this animosity between the sexes.
Right.
Women then don't trust men, and men don't want to be with women,
Tension.
and it causes problems in a different direction as well.
Exactly. So what's the remedy? So as we try to do this, the remedy
donate to HLI.
The remedy is return to God. Return to what God has created, and to really grow in a deeper understanding of God's design.
Yes.
And so that is, so how do we bring that remedy to bear? So what we're doing today is trying to do that by talking about it, getting people to come to the document itself. What does the church actually teach? Not someone's commentary alone. There are many great commentaries, but what is actually said? What did it say? What did Paul VI actually reaffirm? So, and what is he saying is the remedy going forward? And then what do we hear Paul VI and what do we hear John Paul II talk about is how is the church and how is society helping couples? In other words, where is our response to the situations that maybe bring people to difficulties of life? How are we responding to them? How are we helping them? How are we changing the sociological, cultural situations that we're faced with? How are we addressing? If people are concerned about demography, let's talk this out. What do you mean by that? And okay, maybe there are legitimate concerns. What is our proper response to that? How do we address that? But the answer is never to choose what is evil and think that's going to be the solution. It's not the solution. It will never be the solution. And by the prophecies that Paul VI spoke about, show that this is all that's come to bear, and far worse. And so now all these things that we have in front of us, the only way to unravel them is to return where we support marriage between one man and one woman, where we teach the authenticity and the beauty of conjugal love and what that means, and that we value marriage as indissoluble, exclusive, and where children are welcomed, by their mother and by their father and nurtured in that family. We need to return to where society itself supports family life, and recognize that it is upon that cell that the society finds purpose and meaning and healing.
And we can't be afraid to talk about this issue either. Like, obviously, contraception is widely accepted in today's society, but I think that a lot of people just think there's other bigger issues to deal with. We don't have to deal with this one right now, but just the more that I learn about it and think about it, the more I realize that so many of the big issues that we're dealing with now have their root in contraception. Obviously, we have a whole ebook on how contraception leads to the abortion culture, but also when Dr. Jennifer Morse was on the podcast, she was talking about how it leads to the LGBTQ ideology, because as soon as you accept sterile acts as being the same as a conjugal act, then why not have it between a man and a man or a woman and a woman? That's also sterile. They're just expressing their love to each other.
Exactly.
And what he was saying about the tendency of man to think that he should have dominion over his body leads to the transgender issue. So there's so many of these big issues that people are appalled by today. And how did we get here? It's like, well, we got here because we accepted contraception.
That's right. And it's mentality. That's the main thing. So that's and it's beautiful how you just did it. You just summarized the whole thing. because that's exactly correct. I mean, and so how do you unravel it?
Mhm.
It's by returning to a sense of God
Mhm.
and returning to a sense of who is man and who is woman.
And we're never going to be able to fix these big problems if we don't heal what's going on at the root.
You have to heal the root. And so that's why it's the mentality that is such the enemy here,
Mhm.
because the mentality says, I know what's best for myself.
Mhm.
I know the good. And so even in the argumentation of the Commission, you still heard that same kind of language where they're trying to, in a sense, manipulate, in order to give circumstance.
Mhm. Well, they're taking as the premise that this could be a moral means to achieve the ends that
And
they
right.
want. And it's intrinsically evil. It's not a moral means to achieve anything. And that's where
That's
the
right.
root of the problem lies.
In and of itself, it is an evil that you cannot choose. It's an act that you can never employ. And no matter how you window dress it, it still remains what it is. And so so the fruit that we've seen of it is the result of accepting an evil and trying to call it a good.
Exactly.
And so in a sense, so how do you get the cat back in the bag, so to speak? How do you get the bird back in the cage?
How do you get all the milks cleaned up?
Yeah, so how do you do this? And this is where teaching, so chastity and purity and teaching the beauty of the human person, the beauty of a theology of the body that people understand, and we can and how to return people to a mindset that there is a boundary upon which I should not cross. So it's accepting my limitedness, and realizing I'm a finite being, right? That I have a limitation, and that though I've been given a functionality, but the functionality is not necessarily something I cannot control or have the ability to participate or not participate in, because there's a larger good. There's an understanding of purpose, and so in a ways, it's how do we teach that again? It was once, and without being seen as taboo, which can be used as a good or a bad, but it's just the idea but seen as a good. And if I may, I just kind of, in a way of kind of bringing this, to kind of an example, I remember several times encountering moms, dads, who learned that their teenage children, male, female, were struggling with impurity. And the question was, what do I do? How do I address this, Father? And for many times, it might have been their first teenager. So they're still young parents encountering for the first time. And my question or my observation was always, we've all been there. We've all been in these moments as we mature. We're faced with temptation. We're faced with thoughts. Our bodies are changing. Our psychological aspects are changing. Much is going on. More than ever, we need guidance. And we need people not parents to be always in the sense of tell everything, but how to say, I understand, son. I understand, daughter. I understand. Been there. Now, teenager might want to hear that. But if you've built that relationship of trust from when they're little infants, and they see you as the model and an example of how husband treats wife and wife treats dad, and they see in that family environment this wholeness, this respect, this beauty, they're drawn to that.
Yeah.
And so when they now are confronted with temptation that's coming from whatever direction, is where should they turn? They should turn where they've always turned, mom and dad, to be able to talk to them. But many times I find parents so afraid to talk about the beauty of human sexuality, the beauty of your body maturing toward an end. It's actually moving toward an ability to do something that only in an adult body beyond puberty is able to achieve. But there is a proper place, a proper understanding. And by proper, I mean a holiness, a wholeness that if you remove it from that, you're changing it. You're making it into something that it's not. And so by falling into impurity, you're actually changing something as well to help them to see that. And I have found that when parents engaged, obviously the struggles are still there, but they can see that it's a struggle that can be life-giving, and it can lead them down a very happy way of life. And to be able one day, if called to married life, in that life, to be able to understand what chastity means within marriage, to be chaste within marriage, to be pure within marriage, and to treat the other of what Paul VI is talking about with beauty and awe and wonder, and always be in that awe and wonder, and not look at each other as purely a means to an end, but to see in each other a participatory and a way of expressing bonding and love that is always fruitful. That's a language that doesn't get talked about. And it should. And it should. And we shouldn't be ashamed of it, and we should be able to express that and joyfully talk about it. But we've allowed it to be, like it's something that's horrible. No. And so we really, Colleen, have allowed the world to control the conversation.
Yeah.
And so we have allowed the very things that Paul VI was addressing to control the conversation. And let's be honest, and I'll close with this from my own comment, unless you ask me another question, and that is to think about why so many people don't hear this from the pulpit, why they don't hear this in their catechism classes, or in their formation courses, or in our Catholic institutions. It's just not talked about, and as a result, it becomes, then if it's not talked about, it must be accepted, and as a result,
or at least not condemned.
Right.
Tolerated.
So it must be okay. Oh, it's between you and your spouse. It's your conscience. No, conscience has to be informed. Yes, and in the day you make your decision, but it doesn't mean your decision is without consequence.
It doesn't mean your decision's right.
Exactly. It could be a misguided conscience. And so it's important, which is which John Paul picks up in Veritatis Splendor in great detail. And so that to me is what's important. And I'm just hoping that maybe our listeners, will take advantage of this encouragement.
Yeah.
Read the document.
Read the document
it first.
And don't be afraid to talk about it.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Father, for having this conversation today.
You're welcome.
And to all of our listeners, please follow, and subscribe. I'm going to link our ebook showing how contraception leads to an abortion culture in the description and on the end screen here. So you can check that out as well. Definitely download it and take a look at it. It's really good. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.